we'll be covering Martus and change requests. So we do have a decent agenda today. We'll be doing an overview of the tribal policies and budget modifications, going through the different types of budgets that we have. And once we finish that, we'll get into Martus and actually go through an example of conducting a change request. And when that is through, we'll look at adding new accounts if they haven't been budgeted before, and discuss the approval workflow for a change request. So the general part from our policies and procedures from the accounting manual for budget mods is that there's 4 people involved in the requests. There's the personnel that prepares the budget. They attach documentation supporting their proposal for changes. There's a program monitor that reviews for accuracy, reasonableness, ensures adequate supporting documentation, and if this concerns federal or state funding agency, that those guidelines are being met for the budget. The finance officer is going to be doing the same thing, reviewing for accuracy and reasonableness, ensuring that sufficient revenue sources are available to fund the budget, and verify total amount of the budget mod if necessary. Budget and Finance Committee approval may be required for the change request. And then finally, the chief accountant or bookkeeper verify reasonableness of the date and general ledger period, verify the account numbers being used, add any newly budgeted account numbers for accessibility, and then finally they can post the budget to Intact. And we have another shot from the accounting manual regarding the finance officer role, which the gist of this is if a budget mod exceeds $10,000, it requires that the Budget and Finance Committee approve the request before it occurs, and then that can be attached to the request showing the approval's been obtained. So as we go through the different types of budgets that the tribe has, the primary one would be the general fund, which is funded directly by the tribe. There's no carryover for budgeted funding sources here. New proposals are prepared by the programs themselves. They use the fiscal year series of financial reports to get information about their spending, amounts available for each line item. Programs here using the general fund can use the Intact Budget Comparison Report in Intact to see a historical budgetary information. And they use the same funding source year over year. So anyone who's assigned that would use the same one in FY22 and so on. Indirect costs, very similar to general fund. There's no carryover for budgeted funding sources. New proposals are prepared by the programs themselves. They use the fiscal year series of financial reports. The Intact Budget Comparison Report can be used to provide historical budgetary information. In other words, if we're preparing an annual report, this is to give us an idea of what our budget has been year over year. Funding sources remain the same. The casino, almost exactly what general and indirect are. There's no carryover. New proposals prepared by the programs. They use the fiscal series of reports as well. Intact Budget Comparison can give you a historical budgetary outlook. They use the same funding sources, and this can be volatile based on the projections and performance of the casino. So whatever we propose might end up getting changed throughout the year if circumstances change in revenue collection. Now we get into the different ones. Federal and state grants. These are funded by an award. Carryover may be determined on grant conditions. The award length is determined by grant conditions. So unlike the first 3 we've gone through, they might not be just one single year. New proposals are prepared by programs, and the financial reports they're going to use depends on the length of the grant. Single year grants use the fiscal series of reports, unless the fiscal period for the grant's not aligned to the tribe's fiscal year. The tribe operates from October to September. If that grant has a fiscal period outside of that period of time, they would need to use the life-to-date reports to be able to grab the budgetary and spending information that would span at least 2 of the tribe's fiscal years. Multi-year grants are going to use the life-to-date series of reports to capture all the spending and budgetary activity for the life of that grant. And if a single-year grant is granted an extension for spending, they'll switch to using the life-to-date, since their budget and spending would mostly be in one fiscal year, and then the extension might go into a new fiscal year. Intact budget comparisons can give us historical budgetary information about these grants. It also helps us identify which base year the budget is actually in. So when we're preparing a modification in Martus, we can use that to help us figure out where to go in Martus, which fiscal year we need to be in. And here, funding sources do change for federal and state grants. So as each new award is granted, we're going to change the funding source numbers to a different one. So like we give an example below, one of the numbering sequences for Head Start, in which we put the fiscal year after each of the award numbers or fund number. 638 contracts are funded by contracts issued through BIA or IHS. There's no carryover for budgeted funding sources. The budget continues every year it's permissible to spend. New proposals are prepared by programs based on the anticipated contract awards, communication with SRD and health admin. Budgets are adjusted to match the CRs as they come in at each budgeting period. They use the life-to-date series of reports, since these contracts typically are going to last longer than one fiscal year. And we can use the intact budget comparison to either get historical budgetary information or to find where the base budget year is for modifications in Martus. And funding sources change with each new contract. And finally, revenue funds. Funded by the receipt of revenue produced by the activities of a funding source. Solid waste would be an example. They bill their customers for solid waste services. That's how they generate revenue, and that's what they operate from. They do have a carryover process each year to move the fund from the outgoing year into the new fiscal year. Those are actions performed by the program monitor. So when that's completed, program would be notified. That's covered in a different training actually this afternoon. New proposals are prepared by programs. They use the fiscal series of reports until the year ends. So for example, the year is going to end this week. And so until the carryover is done when we close the books on fiscal year 21, during that period of time from October 1st till November 15th, they would use reports called revenue funds, current and prior until carryover. So if you're generating revenue, you would be using that because that's going to grab the prior year's performance and the current year's performance until the carryover is complete and we've closed the books on the fiscal year. The intact budget comparison reports can provide historical budgetary information for these revenue funds. So if we're preparing our new proposals, we would have an idea of what revenue we're actually generating year over year. Their funding sources remain the same, and of course there's volatility here. It's not an award that's typically static with what's been awarded. This is going to be based on your projections and then the actual performance of whether or not people are paying their solid waste bills or other bills that are generated from the programs using Intact for this purpose. All right, so we're going to get out of here and go into Martus. If you have any questions as we go through, please use the chat box in the bottom right of your screen. When we log into Martus, for most users, we're going to have the welcome screen, the dashboard, and planner. Planner is where we're going to visit to begin our change request. And depending on your level of access, you may have some different menu options, but the most important ones: summary, worksheet, change request. So for any budget modification, we're visiting the change request screen. So if I click here, it's going to take us to change request, and depending on the level of access you have, that will determine what you're going to see on the majority of the screen here. So we're going to, when we log in, it's going to beyond the current fiscal year we're operating in. So we can see fiscal year 21 on the screen. And if you have pending activity or you've had drafts where we started a change request and didn't submit it, that's going to be listed below. And if you've had any change requests denied, that would be listed as well. But this is just the active items that haven't been completed, nothing approved, is what you're going to see on the list. You can, with any of the transactions that are in draft or denied, you can edit those and resubmit if that's what we need to do. Or we can view items that are submitted and find out exactly where at in the workflow they are. This is what you can see here. If you do have a lot of activities that's listed here and you want to sort it differently, next to each of the columns is an up and down arrow that would allow us to change the sorting on the screen. So for the default right now, it starts with the oldest one for the current fiscal year and goes down to the most current event. If I wanted to change that order, certainly click the arrow and have that reversed so that now the most current one is at top and the older stuff is down below. We can do that by user as well. Put the users or the creators in alphabetical order or reverse alphabetical order. Same thing with the status. So now I have all the denied ones together, the draft ones, and then the submitted ones. So there's some sorting options. For most users, this might not be useful if we don't have a lot of activity to sort through and we only have a couple on screen, but certainly a valuable tool if you need to use this. We do have the boxes above, which allow us to filter a little bit more. These boxes aren't going to help us prepare a change request. It has nothing to do with starting a new one. But if we were researching for a specific funding source, or we wanted to look at a completed one that had been done previously, you can come in here, find your funding source, so we have a funding source selected. We have fiscal year 21, and we can change the status to look for any instance in which this funding source was used and the status of that funding source is completed. We can use a period of time if we only wanted to research a certain period of time. If there was one specific user, you could certainly use that person to search by user. And then we can click filter and it'll start to run based on the funding source and the complete date. And of course, for those of us who've been using Martus, this might take a minute or two for the system to generate the results that I'm looking for. Okay. Now that it's done, obviously the screen has changed if you're watching the screen. Now that the only things that are listed are any budget mods that was using this funding source that are completed, meaning fully approved. And so we can see a long list of what those are. And we can view any of those changes that were done. And if we're researching a specific line, we can download these changes into an Excel report by clicking here. And we would see the line items and the changes for every line and every budget that's on this list. Or if we clicked report, we'd see that report within Martus that we can have on screen and use to search as well. So the download report option is a pretty good one if we're researching changes to a specific line, if we're trying to get a better understanding of why the budget is what it is now, if we need to see other changes that were done. So that's the tools that we have on screen for filter. The next option we have, of course, is actually starting a new change request. If we're going to make a change to an existing budget, this is where we're going to go to make a change. We're not going to go to worksheets. We're going to change request and then the blue create new change request button. So when we click that, we're going to be taken to a screen that summarizes the request we're working on, which is nothing to show yet since we haven't started it. We'll be given the fiscal year that we're working on for budget, the date we've created this, who the user is, the current status, which is draft, and then of course the budget changes, which are nothing until we start to build this out, which we can do by clicking the blue add button. But what we need to do before we start going through to start our change request is we need to plan the request, have the information we need at hand to make sure we're going to do this right the first time and not have any unexpected delays for declines or information like that. So how do we plan our request? The first thing we should be doing is getting a copy of our financial report from Intact. So we have the latest information available to us before we get started. So I do have a tab for Intact open. We can access this information by going to Reports and then to Report Center. And for an example today, I'm going to use a general fund account. So from that overview of the different budget types, general fund uses the fiscal year reports. You land on the screen, you certainly can scroll down until we get to the F section for fiscal year. Or we can use the search bar and type fiscal and choose the report we want. Most general fund accounts don't generate revenue, so they're going to be using a fiscal year expense account. I'm only going to pull up from one funding source, so I've got the one funding source view highlighted here. We know for our budget mods, we need to attach a copy of our financial report. So if I ran this here directly on screen, I'd have to run it twice because then I'd also need it as a PDF. So rather than doing that, I'm going to export this report as a PDF. And we'll tell Intact what our program is, what our checkbook is. And we're running the one funding source view report, so we definitely want to specify the funding source that we're going to run this report for. If we have multiple funding sources under the program checkbook combination, and we don't specify funding source, our report may combine those funding sources and give you information that won't match Martus. So I've got that specified. Now we can run the report. And when that's ready, we can go to the next part of planning our request. So we definitely have been able to identify the funding source. We know our checkbook, and we know our program that we're using, which is going to be very important over here, because when we click to add, we're going to be given a list of the programs and checkbooks we have access to. And so we need to know which combination the funding source belongs to before we get started. So the funding source I'm using is to the general operating program, which has just the one checkbook assigned to it. So easy one to find if we just have one checkbook to work with. So I'm going to select that. If there's more than one funding source that goes to that combination, we're going to be given the list of all of that stuff here. All of those things that have had active budget in the fiscal year, all the funding sources. So we can scroll through to look for that. Or we can go in just a little bit further. And I'm going to filter to that specific funding source. So I've got it selected, and I'm going to hit filter. All the other things that aren't going to be thought of is going to be included now. Just the one funding source. So up here, the PDF for the report has been generated. So now we have that. We can save this to our desktop. Easiest, if you're using Chrome, is when you go to print a document, you can actually get save as PDF as an option. So I'm going to go ahead and save this to our desktop. And we can see on screen, we have some issues with our budget. We certainly have two line items that are over budget. The interest expense loan payments has no budget, but it does have expenses for the year totaling $7,300, meaning we're over budget by that amount. And then the community cleanup allocation has a $45,000 budget, but $60,000 in expenses, so that's over budget. So if this is what we were going to work on, we now have an idea of, okay, we're getting ready to plan our request. We know which ones need to be addressed to prevent overspending. So we have that clear. We know that these totals exceed $10,000. This combined is $22,000. So this might trigger us having to go to Budget and Finance to seek their approval that we're going to prepare a change request to get these properly accounted for. More importantly, which line item is going to cover these being over budget? What line can we reduce and include here? So we do have some line items that haven't been used at all this year. So if we're planning our budget mod, those appear to be the most reasonable things to be using to reduce, to get these two lines corrected. In the budget types, we talked about the possibility, or in the review of the possibility, federal or state funding agency approval is needed. This is a general account, so that's not going to be necessary for us. So we don't need to worry about that. We're going to be looking at Budget and Finance because of the amount of the budget mod. Now we know which accounts we have availability to use. For example, if we were trying to use this Miss Rosebud pageant account, which has a $6,000 budget, it has expenses there for $750. So the full budget of $6,800 certainly wouldn't be available to be used. We could use up to $6,000 of that if we were going to use it for other things. So there's a question, how can a voucher be processed without a budget entered? This particular interest expense isn't done through voucher. It's already charged by the bank, so that's done by journal entry, which requires no budget verification. And the community cleanup allocation was spent before budgets were approved for the fiscal year, so at the time they had an adequate budget until the approval was given by council, which reduced their budget from $60,000 to $45,000. So that just hasn't been addressed since that change happened in, I believe, at the end of March. If we were budgeting revenue, we'd want to make sure that we have enough revenue we've collected to cover any of the mods we're making to our expenses. We want to make sure that there's enough unused funds in that budget for anything we're trying to do. And then for the accounts receivable funds, we'd want to make sure that they've reduced their revenue by any outstanding bills that haven't been paid to them yet. So I'm going to slide this report off screen so we can come back to this here in a second. So we're going to get started on our change request. Interest expense loan payments is one of the lines that we have to address. So it just so happens that it is here. It doesn't have a current budget, which we've seen on the report. So we're going to select that line. On the report, the total amount of charges this year is $7,350.33. So if we were going to create a budget to zero that out, that's the amount we're going to want to add to this line. That's what we're going to want the revised line item to be. We can do that in two ways. Going into the month of October, so we can see that it's the first line. The current budget is zero. This is easy math for us, so we can certainly come in here, type that amount, and then click save. One method, easy if it's something like this. A second option you do have is we're going to set this back to zero. Is we can change the adjustment type to an additional amount and enter that in the month of October. And when I hit preview, that adds the current state plus what I entered. So if we had a more complicated budget, we might be doing that here. So once we get the amount, what we want the new budget to be, not the amount of the adjustment, but we want the new budget on the report to now total this amount. We're ready to move forward with this, and we can click save. And so now our summary has something that we've entered. We can see the checkbook, the program, there's that account number, and there's the funding source. All things we should be looking for as we're preparing each and every single line. The current state went from nothing to a proposal of spending $7,350. So we'd be comfortable there. And now we can move to the next line. So we can click add. And now the next line we were looking at is the community cleanup allocation. And this is going to look a little different since it already has a budget. The current state's $45,000. The revised line is going to be what do we want the new budget to total, not how much do we want the budget to change by. So if we look on this report, here's that line. There's that $45,000 budget. This is how much has been spent this year. If there was going to be no further spending, we were going to end this year, which ends after tomorrow. We're going to end at $60,968.48. That's what we want that new budget to be in the revised total, is $60,000, not the difference of $15,000. So when we go back to Martus, it's a very easy change for us because we want it to total the total expenses for the year. So now we have the budget. We're proposing to change it from currently at $45,000. Our revision says we want it to be now a total of $60,000. Once we have that, we can hit save. There's our checkbook, our program, there's that account number. And here's our funding source. So we've got all the information we need. There's that $45,000 budget. There's $45,000 budget. So we're sitting good. All our stuff matches. Now, some of us might think, hey, we've done what we needed to do. We've increased those two line items. We're zeroing them out. We're done. We can add our financial report, pop in an explanation of what that is and whatever information we might have. And then we can hit submit and move on. But one thing that we should mind here is we're proposing to increase our expenses, but there's nothing to offset those. So the finance officer, when she reviews budget mods, is going to be looking to make sure the funds are enough to cover what we're proposing. In other words, it has to balance something. So we're going to have to offset this by decreasing expenses, our expense budget, from another line item. So we identified one of the line items we could use. We're going to keep this little amount right here in line, the $23,255.83. So we're going to use the other method for reducing this line. So we're going to add. We still have the other budget up, not all those other ones that we filtered out. And we're going to reduce this line item, Spotted Tail Children's Home. What do we need the new budget to be? Well, we're proposing changes that total $23,000. So we can take out our phone to get the calculator, bring our computer calculator on screen, do that too, or we could use that additional amounts. So I'm gonna go to additional type, switch to additional amounts. What do we want to do? We want to take out $23,255.83, which you can see grayed out a little bit. I got the minus sign in front of it. So if I hit preview, what happens? That amount's been reduced by $23,000. just the amount that we've entered. Easier than pulling out a calculator, writing it down, save us a little time here. So I've got that in, and I can hit save. Checkbook, our program, our account number, our funding source are there. We can see that proposal from $113,000 budget currently to we want it to be revised to $90,000. We're increasing our expenses by $23,000 and we're decreasing it by the same amount. The bottom line is that net change is $0. So we've got a budget mod that balances. On the financial report, if we're using this line here, we know if we decrease the budget from $113,000 to $90,000, there's been no expenses marked against this. So it's not going to put this line over budget. So that's not going to have a negative impact on this modification. We feel pretty good about where we're at. Now comes time where we're going to type up a change request explanation. I had a message that said I asked programs to put the funding source number in the explanation box. Is it this explanation box that you're talking about? You can answer that, Mary. So while she's answering that, we're going to add our attachment. We can only have one attachment. So if we have this financial report, and then we might have the budget and finance motion, or if you're a federal grant or a state grant, you might have their approval too. We're going to go ahead and have all of that as one document. And so once we have that document ready, we're going to choose our file. There's the file I created. And now I have that attached, so anyone that's going to review this can see the attachment I'm using to base my decision off of, or to support the request I'm making. My explanation might be something simple here to include, that we're covering negative amounts from the financial report. Mary, the question was, is this the explanation box you asked people to put the funding source number at? Okay. And so we might also want to include the funding source number or numbers if we're doing multiple funds from this list. And so we have all of that ready. We have our supporting documents. And Mary, the monitor, is saying she wants that funding source at the front of your explanation. So there we are. If we're ready to submit this, then we can go ahead and hit submit for approval, and off to the races it goes to the approvers. With this one, I'm not going to submit it. I'm just going to save. By saving it, that puts this into draft. I can come back and edit this, make any changes. Each line can still be edited, so if there was an amount that we needed to change, by all means we can make that change here. Or we can continue to add new lines if there was more work that needed to be done within the financial report. So if we come back out to change requests, I'm going to reverse the order so we can get that one I just did on top. There we are. We can see the fiscal year, the date. Here I am. Here's the status of it. It's drafted. And then here's that explanation right here. So that would help sort out which type of budget mod this is or who it's for. Okay, do we have any other questions or anything else? Anyone want to add anything else to the change request process right here? Okay. If you do, please use the chat box. So once we submit this for approval, we're going to have an approval process that we can look at, and just kind of like what we discussed earlier. At the bottom of the mod, once we've sent this through, we're going to see all the different people that can approve. Typically, the first person or the worksheet approver is the head of the department, whoever's been designated by them to approve. The level 1 approver is the finance officer, which is Frida, and then Lynette's her backup. The level 2 approver is a program monitor. And the level 3 approver is the accountant, which is Lori. And I'm backing her up this week, so I'll be looking at budget mods as they're done this week. And along each way, each person can make the decision to approve or deny and add a comment as to why that decision has been made if it's needed. Okay, let's go back into the one I've just drafted. So if we were going to create a new line item, meaning one that hasn't been budgeted before, and we were going to add that next as our 4th line on the budget, it's going to be the same way we've just done these, or at least this is how we're going to start. We're going to go to the blue add button. We're going to filter this back out to what we want to see. So we're going to select our program and checkbook combination. I'm going to filter this just so we see the one fund that we're working on right now. But if we need to add a new account number, one that hasn't been used. So when we look at the financial report here, we can see all the accounts that have had activity. And so for this example, we can clearly see employees is not budgeted. So maybe for this one, we're going to happen to create an employee line item on budget because there's going to be a special charge to that for this year. Employees is clearly not on this list, but below the account numbers is a drop-down box for account, one for your funding source, and a gray add button. So if we were going to add a line item for employees, you can either do that by typing the account number, or you can just start typing the word employees, and Martus will start matching to what you're typing, so whichever is most convenient for you. So I've got tribal employees selected. It is very important you pick a funding source here. In most cases, users aren't going to be filtering to a funding source. So this might just say funding source. Now let's see what happens if we don't pick a funding source. So I've got tribal employees picked. I'm gonna click add. We're creating our new $5,000 budget for this. So we've got $5,000 as a revised line. We have that worksheet. There's our account number and our program number. There's the general ledger account number. Funding source is blank here. Martus kind of doesn't care about this part, so we're going to hit save. If this worked out with the rest of the budget, and we have that checkbook, program, account, no funding source, this is going to be allowed to be submitted. And if none of the 4 people who look at this to approve catch that this line doesn't have the funding source, it's going to get approved and posted to intact. But your funding source won't be affected by it because the funding source isn't there. So as we're adding new account numbers, please be careful of that part. The account number and the funding source are both needed. So if we've made this error, we catch it, now we want to correct this. There's an edit button. The only thing we can change is the amount that we're budgeting. We can't change what we've picked on this request line. So we'd actually have to delete that line item. And now we can go back to adding that account number and then the actual funding source that we want to use. So we're going to go down to the bottom. We're going to find that account for tribal employees. When we get that funding source, we pick that, we have both of those in there. If we're not sure of the number, it's usually going to be right there above if we have a current budget. So here we are. Now I can add this line. Here we can now see that checkbook program combo. Here's that account number. The funding source is listed. And now, just like the others, we have all of that information within the line. Now we'd be ready to submit if this balanced out, since it no longer balances by just $5,000. All right. So with that said, that's the end of this presentation. Does anyone have any questions right now? This would be a great time for questions. Oh, great point too, Mary. So when we're talking about the budget types, so we know that the general fund budget operates within one single fiscal year. In a couple of days, our fiscal year is going to change, and we'll be on fiscal year 22. So if we're looking to modify the fiscal year 21 budget, we're going to have to make sure that when we're at the change request screen, that we've jumped into the correct fiscal year. So if we're paying old bills, now it's fiscal year 22, we still have some open items from 21 that we're paying. We're going to make sure that we change the fiscal year to fiscal year 21, click filter, and now we can access the fiscal year 21 budget. If we are a federal grant program or a state grant program, sometimes it's not as easy to know. Which year are we going to do the budget mod in, and how do we figure that out? Easiest way is to go into Intact, go to Report Center, and find a report called Intact Budget Comparisons. So if we have a program, so we have maternal, child, and health. So we're going to look at maternal, child, and health, checkbook 2. We're not going to put in a funding source because we want all the funding sources to show up. And we're going to click OK to let this run. Now we're going to get a list, all the funding sources that have been created for this program is going to be listed throughout this stuff. And we can see there's different columns for each different fiscal year, FY21, FY20, FY19. So if we were going to do a budget mod for these particular grant funds, we can see all of its budget is in this very last column for fiscal year 19. So when we go into Martus to budget for this, we'd want to make sure we go into fiscal year 19, click filter, and once that changes and we're ready to create a new change request, we can see the year now says 19 instead of 21 like it did in the earlier example. So this report is going to very quickly help us jump into the right years. We're started off on the right foot. Our financial reports, especially the life-to-date reports, aren't really going to be helpful in determining that. We get this date, which at least helps us know that this particular report's for FY21. But when it's a fiscal or a financial life-to-date report, that's going to cover multiple fiscal years. So we're just going to see a budget number, not necessarily know which year it is in Martus. What is the base year for that grant? So this is going to point us in that direction. And now we can come back in here, start our budget mod, and make whatever changes we have necessary. And then we start off in the right year and won't be wondering, why is there a grant not there? And there's a question about, do we always enter our budgets in October? Typically, yes. It keeps everything consistent with how we're going to enter budgets. No confusion of why is this particular month a negative $400 or whatever. We work within that one budget and we're only making changes to that one budget number consistently throughout the life of that funding source. So when we're adding our new budget lines, we definitely want to be using the month of October for that. Mary has something to add here, like for example, for her water grants, they started in fiscal year 2018. So the program, even now to this day, still uses 18 as the base for making changes to their budget. EPA had awards that started in 2020. They still switched to 2020 to do budget mods, even as it's 21 now, and after tomorrow it'll be 22, they would switch back. All her revenues are fiscal year, so they just stay in the year that they're operating that it is currently. But if you're not sure, start here first with the Intech Budget Comparison Report, and that's going to tell you, it's particularly if you're a grant program who has funds that last more than one fiscal year, or are funds that don't coincide to the tribe zone fiscal year, like diabetes runs from January to December. So their program runs over 2 different fiscal years for the tribe. So they rely on a life-to-date report, and a report like this would help them remember where the base year is for their budget. All right, I think that's everything that's been put in the chat box. Hopefully you found this helpful. With the recording of this and then the presentation I have, I'll send this out to everybody when that stuff's ready. Otherwise, thank you all for your time. Have a good rest of the day.